Hi, I'm Kim Drumgo, and I'm here with Khalil Smith from the Neuro Leadership Institute here in Durham, North Carolina. And today we're going to talk about unconscious bias. And Khalil is gracious enough to share with us a lot of information on unconscious bias. And so we're going to start first by the definition. So what is unconscious bias?
Yeah, it's a great place to start with the definition of the thing that we're going to talk about for a while. And the reason it's a great place to start is because there is a lot of confusion around what we would refer to as unconscious bias. So it's talked about in a lot of different ways, and I think one of the kind of loose definitions that we can use as part of this conversation are just natural human habits, preferences, orientations, dispositions that unintentionally and subtly influence the decisions that we make about the things that we like or don't like, the places that we spend our time, but it's all of these things that are going on under the surface, and I think one of the most important elements of it that we lose sight of sometimes is the unconscious part. And so bias is just about preferences, and unconscious is, I can't really put my finger on it, but this is why I feel the way I do.
Got it. So you talk about why. So why do we we have unconscious biases?
Yeah.
Why do they exist?
They exist because, as mean as it can be to say, our bodies are super lazy. And so we have evolved over a long period of time to conserve energy and to conserve resources. And so when we think about our modern day workplaces or just the civilizations we work in, we have not necessarily evolved for where we are right now. So through evolution, we've evolved to use as little energy as we possibly can, and for our bodies to take shortcuts wherever they can. And so one of the things that comes up quite often is our brains only take about 2% of our total kind of body mass, but they consume about 20% of our daily glucose. And so our brains are always trying to kind of take a shortcut, make it a bit easier, and that's why we get the shortcuts that we do, and why our brains kind of prefer bias.
Okay, good. And so you talk about our brains prefer. So who has bias? Are there any groups of people that have bias, unconscious bias?
Kim, you have it, and I don't, if that's helpful. No, we all do. And I think it's one of the things that we struggle with so often at times is this feeling that, like, I'm not biased. I care about different people. You'll hear people say, like, I'm not biased against women. I have daughters. I'm not biased against people of a particular ethnicity. I have friends of that ethnicity. And we conflate bias with racism or sexism or bigotry. And some of those things are very conscious. And so again, when we talk about unconscious, or when we talk about bias, a great example of that is, have you ever left your home to get to work and you just lose track of time and you just show up, right? Whether you're in a city and you just know what train you need to go to, that habit just has kind of embedded itself, or you eat at the same places pretty regularly, or you find yourself connecting to similar types of people. We all do that, and in most instances, it's actually not a bad thing. A lot of bias is really productive. It's the reason that we don't have to think deeply about, am I gonna brush my teeth this morning? Oh my gosh. Am I gonna eat breakfast? Oh, I can't decide whether to do that or not, right? We just get into these kind of routines and these habits, but there are things in the workplace and things in our lives that we would refer to as kind of maladaptive. And so even though evolution has kind of pushed us in a particular direction, now that we've shifted and changed, and the average Fortune 500 company has 55,000 employees, that is much bigger than our brains are used to. And so now we need to think differently about how do we put systems in place, how do we mitigate that bias selectively and productively.
Right. So you talked a little bit about the pros, right? So it helps us get through the day, helps us make decisions, and I often call that lazy brain, driving from one point to the next and not even knowing how I got there. But what are some of the cons to bias, and how does that show up in the workplace?
Yeah, the cons are the ones that I think we hear about more than anything. And so, again, we can separate out kind of intentional racism or sexism or some of that, but the unintentional things, the unconscious things, are just as negative for the people who are on the receiving end of that. And so if, for instance, I have a particular preference for a type of employee, and that is the only type of person that I tend to give rewards to and give opportunities to and hire and promote, well, that has significant consequences for the people who are not in my preferred group. And so the more power that I have, the more kind of asymmetric control over valued resources, the more important it is that I mitigate my bias because it has significant impacts on everyone else. we talk quite a bit about the people side of bias,
Right.
but there's also a very significant business side of bias, which is if I am getting ready to choose a vendor based on the fact that I like that vendor, not based on the fact that they're a better discount or a better vendor or a better product, that has significant and material financial impacts on the organization. So when we think about how bias plays in, it's just a matter of there aren't always the times that we want to take shortcuts. Sometimes we do want to pause and be really deep and reflective about the decisions that we're making and understand not just what's going on kind of above the waterline, if you think almost of an iceberg, but let me get a little bit more into what's going on below and just make better output in terms of decisions.
Got it. So you started talking about some of the mitigating ways that we can mitigate bias.
Yeah.
So can you go into more detail about that? How can we as individuals and organizations mitigate bias in some of the decisions that we're making on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I will tell you, the thing that we wish we all could do that is actually not as effective as we wish it was is awareness.
Right.
And it's the reason that we see so much awareness training wind up not being all that effective.
Right.
Because what happens is, I work with an amazing Chief Science Officer, Heidi Grant, who always says, if I stopped you and said, hey, think about if you're being biased, you go, no, I'm okay. I'm not making a biased decision, right? That is, just because I tell you that these things are going on doesn't mean that you can change them because they are evolutionary, because they are unconscious. And so what we need to do is to mitigate bias at the team level and at the organizational level. And some very practical examples of that are if I have a preference for a particular type of employee, and as I interview, I find out that person went to my alma mater, and so immediately they kind of rise.
They elevate in your priority list.
Exactly. They kind of become a part of what we refer to as my in-group. One of the things that we can do is standardize the questions that we're going to give to everyone.
Right.
Or remove some of the characteristics that are not relevant to the job.
Right.
Or institute a more panel-oriented type of interview process so that your bias and my bias start to kind of counteract one another. And so those are things we can do at the organizational and kind of the team and the institutional level, as opposed to saying, Khalil, you may be biased when you're interviewing people. Stop doing that. And I'm going to say, okay, I didn't think I was doing it before, but I'll do it even less now. That's not effective. And so we want awareness so that people understand, but that awareness needs to be married with really practical kind of habits and mitigation strategies.
Good. So now then you talked a little bit about some of those different biases. So give us just a flavor of some of the different biases that show up.
Yeah. So there are over 150 different cognitive biases and heuristics that social scientists have kind of pulled out. One of the things that we've done is tried to simplify those down into 5 based on the way that they're mitigated in the brain. So the first would be something called similarity bias, which is this idea that people like me are better than others, right? People that are in my in-group are ones that I connect with more. This expedience bias, which is if it feels right, it must be true. Right? I'm just going to go with my gut instinct. I'm just going to do this thing because something's telling me that it's right. That something is biased. Doesn't always mean that it's right. Experience bias, which is I see the world through my own eyes, and we all believe we're the hero of our own story, right? Distance bias is this idea that close is better than distant. So there's more than enough research that shows that if you and I work close to one another, we'll be closer partners. If you're my boss, you're more likely to promote me or to give me better reviews. And then the last is safety bias. We've got significant amounts of our brain that's dedicated to detecting threat, and about 5 times as much as detecting reward. And so we tend to naturally shy away from threats or shy away from things that we believe to be less than safe. So those 5 really encompass over 150 different types of biases, and there are specific mitigation strategies for each one of them.
Wow, well that's great. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge around unconscious bias. It's so very important, and I think all of us are impacted by unconscious bias on a day-to-day basis. So thank you, Khalil Smith, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks to all of you, and thank you for joining our Human Intelligence episode.